Europe accusing the U.S. of war profiteering is like, yeah, we're the U.S. That's like kind of our whole thing.
As you all know, I'm awfully critical of Kyle Kulinski on this channel. I have to say, though, as far as his commentary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine goes, he's far from the worst. Years ago, before this subject became fashionable, I criticized him for his Russia commentary, and I have to say, I'm pleasantly surprised that since the invasion, he's moved away from his reflexive blame America first tendency, at least when it comes to this specific issue.
NATO encroachment, yes, I used to think that was, if not the only reason for Russian aggression, I thought it was maybe the predominant reason. That like the majority reason why they're doing what they're doing is because they feel existentially threatened by NATO encroachment. Now, having watched the war unfold, having seen the actions that Putin has taken, and I think more importantly, just listen to his own words in his speech when he announced the invasion, I'm now of the belief that I think he would have done this anyway, even if NATO never expanded.
I'm sad to say that I cannot say the same for a number of leftists, libertarians, and national conservatives. That said, Kyle is far from disabused from his knee-jerk America bad commentary. Today, we'll be looking at what he has to say about this article from Politico. Europe accuses US of profiting from war, referring, of course, to the war in Ukraine. Kyle responds to the article with his same old America bad commentary without bothering to learn any background here. As we'll see, the fundamental causes of the things that the European diplomats are complaining about are not America's fault. In fact, these are things very much of Europe's own making. Their grievances, therefore, should not be directed at the United States, but at their predecessors, as the conditions they find themselves in are a direct result of decisions their own leaders made just a few years prior. Most importantly, we can justifiably say this without the benefit of hindsight. Lots of people predicted exactly these sorts of things would happen many years ago. So, what are the Europeans who are quoted in this article all hot and bothered about? As Politico reports, the fact is, if you look at it soberly, the country that is most profiting from this war is the US, because they are selling more gas at higher prices, and because they are selling more weapons. One senior official told Politico, "It's all got too much for top officials in Brussels and other EU capitals." French President Emmanuel Macron said high US gas prices were not friendly, and Germany's economy minister has called on Washington to show more solidarity and help reduce energy costs. So what are Kyle's thoughts on this situation? It's essentially that, of course the US is war profiting, that's what big bad America does.
It's kind of a crazy headline, right? It's like accusing water of being wet. Oh my god, America's war profiteering. Yeah. Do you know anything about America? Do you remember that whole Iraq war thing? I mean, we have a track record of doing it, particularly post-World War II when we became the world's sole superpower. This is what we do. So look, what they're saying is, we see how much money you guys are making from the war. So that's a bad incentive. Another bad incentive is you just want to see Russia weakened, and so if Ukraine is going to weaken Russia, you cheer that on. But we are bearing the brunt of this entire thing because a lot of European countries got a lot of their oil and gas from Russia, and now that relationship has been cut off. So they have a short supply. Prices have skyrocketed. They're talking about potential blackouts in the middle of the winter, right, where the power goes out. Their economies are getting hammered, and so they are bearing the brunt of this war, and the U.S. is not. We have, again, people making money off of the war, and really it was only 6 or 7% of Russian oil and gas that came into the U.S., and we can more easily make up for that. When there's a war in Europe, the U.S. really has a lot of positive outcomes as a result of it, because we are more isolated geographically. I mean, we have Canada to our north, and we have Mexico to our south, but Europe is a giant mix of all these different countries with different languages and different cultures, and something that happens in Europe affects all of Europe. But it affects us much less. And so now we are the beneficiary of total chaos and war over there. And our allies don't like it.
By the way, the original article and Kyle's response to it are both linked below, just in case you want to look at them for yourself. So, for starters, the big complaint that European officials have was largely omitted from Kyle's commentary. The growing dispute over Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, a huge tax, climate, and healthcare package, has put fears over a transatlantic trade war high on the political agenda again. EU trade ministers are due to discuss their response on Friday as officials in Brussels draw up plans for an emergency war chest of subsidies to save European industries from collapse. The Inflation Reduction Act is very worrying, said Dutch trade person, who I will not try and pronounce their name as I will surely butcher it. The potential impact on the European economy is very big. Kyle only mentions European complaints of these subsidies once in his video.
So really, we're pissing them off on every front. We're pissing them off when it comes to oil and gas. We're pissing them off when it comes to our weapons. We're pissing them off with our investment in green technology. Every action that we're taking has a negative effect on them, and they're beginning to turn on us and turn on the war.
In fact, previously, he's actually praised these green energy investments, corporate welfare, as I like to call them, when the Inflation Reduction Act was first passed.
More than $300 billion would be invested in energy and climate reform, the largest federal clean energy investment in U.S. history. The bill has support from many environmental and climate activists, but is short of the $555 billion that Democrats had originally called for. Again, that was in the original Build Back Better bill. This portion of the bill takes on transportation and electricity generation, and it includes $60 billion for growing renewable energy infrastructure in manufacturing like solar panels and wind turbines. It also includes several tax credits for individuals on things like electric vehicles and making homes more energy efficient. All those things are great, by the way.
This is also a pretty harsh repudiation of the protectionism that he's traditionally championed. I'll talk about that in a later video. Instead of pointing out that the article says that a policy he favored turned out to be a major catalyst for the tension here, he instead chooses to focus his ire on industries he doesn't like. Fossil fuels and defense, and of course, he blames America first. The thing is, European countries were not always this reliant on Russia for energy. Their relationship with Russia is the result of decisions made by European leaders over the last several decades. Decisions that they're now paying for. Germany, the economic powerhouse of continental Europe, as well as the largest economy in the EU, has led the way on shaping Europe's energy policy. Further energy integration with Russia wasn't just the result of geography. It was also a policy choice. As Daniel Yergin writes in the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, West Europeans generally welcomed Russian gas imports. Eastern and Central European countries, much more dependent on Russian gas, saw their reliance as a source of vulnerability, reminding them of their former thraldom to Moscow when they were satellites of the Soviet Union. They would point to cases in which the Soviet Union, and then Russia, they said, used cutoffs and manipulation of supplies to apply political pressure. Despite these warnings, Western Europe decided to go ahead with further energy integration. Germany signed off on Nord Stream, a pipeline that directly connected Russia to Germany. As Jürgen writes, there was much criticism in Central European policy circles and the media over the influence that, it was argued, Russia would gain from the deal. The Western Europeans, particularly the Germans, saw matters differently, as a part of a larger complementary relationship involving markets, trade, and investment, a relationship that was made inevitable by geography. Moreover, while they may have depended on the Russians for gas, Russians depended on them for markets and revenues. Nord Stream went ahead unhindered, culminating in that inauguration ceremony at Lubin in 2011, a ceremony that was attended by German, French, and Dutch leaders, the EU energy minister, and Gerhard Schroeder.
Schroeder has taken quite a bit of money over the years to sit on Gazprom's board. Gazprom is a Russian state oil and gas company.
If you think this sort of integration was inevitable because of geography, 1, I disagree. Russian natural gas imports were capped for West Germany during the Cold War, and the West Germans still had an incredibly strong economy. 2, it's one thing to increase your energy ties with Russia. It's another thing to eliminate other sources of energy simultaneously. After the 2011 Fukushima disaster, Germany decided to phase out its use of nuclear power. On top of that, they didn't have to massively subsidize their own renewable energy programs, while also moving away from more carbon-heavy fossil fuels. This isn't just enormously hypocritical of them to do this and then criticize the United States for doing the same thing. It's also terrible energy policy, as renewables are expensive and notoriously unreliable. As of this year, Germany imports 35% of its crude oil, 55% of its natural gas, and 50% of its hard coal from Russia. That's according to the University of Santa Barbara. So Western European energy policy has been a disaster, and it wasn't inevitable. Furthermore, and I cannot emphasize this point enough, I do not say this with the advantage of hindsight. Lots of people have been ringing the alarm bell on Europe's over-reliance on Russian energy for a long time now. It wasn't just the Central and Eastern Europeans who warned the Western Europeans about this. Even Donald Trump did so at the UN when he was president, and the Germans laughed at him for it.
Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course.
I can't imagine that they're laughing now. Increasing energy ties with Europe was a deliberate part of Vladimir Putin's plans to shield his regime from backlash for his illiberal actions. As Garry Kasparov wrote in Winter is Coming, Why Vladimir Putin and the Enemies of the Free World Must Be Stopped.
Unfortunately, Putin, like other modern autocrats, had and still has an advantage the Soviet leadership could never have dreamed of: deep economic and political engagement with the free world. Decades of trade have created tremendous wealth that dictatorships like Russia and China have used to build sophisticated authoritarian infrastructures inside the country and to apply pressure in foreign policy. The naive idea was that the free world would use economic and social ties to gradually liberalize authoritarian states. In practice, the authoritarian states have abused this access and economic interdependency to spread their corruption and fuel repression at home. To take one easy example, Europe gets a third of its energy from Russia in total, though some individual countries get considerably more. Meanwhile, Europe draws 80% of Russia's energy exports. So who has the greater leverage in this relationship? And yet, during the Ukraine crisis, we have heard it repeated constantly that Europe cannot act against Russia because of energy dependency. 8 months after Putin annexed Crimea, and 3.5 months after evidence mounted that Russian forces had shut down a commercial airliner over Ukraine, Europe was still considering looking at ways to substitute Russian gas. Instead of using the European Union's overwhelming economic influence to deter Putin's aggression, they feign helplessness. An EU boycott or even a hefty tax on Russian energy imports would threaten to completely destroy the Russian economy, which is now entirely dependent on the energy sector to stay afloat. But Europe lacks the political will to make significant sacrifices in the short run to meet the far greater long-term threat that an unchallenged Putin represents to global security and, by extension, their globalization-dependent economies.
He wrote that back in 2015, by the way. Putin obviously loses out on revenues Russia would otherwise gain from gas sales. But he's banking on being able to outlast Europe in this high-stakes game of chicken. Russia does have other customers. And perhaps more importantly, Western European countries are democracies. And hence they have to be more responsive to the interests of regular people. Whereas Russia is an autocracy that really doesn't. Given these latest comments from European diplomats, Vladimir Putin's bet appears to be working. I suspect Western solidarity will only continue to wane as temperatures continue to drop. Of course, energy isn't the only thing that America has been profiting off of. We have also been giving the majority of weapons and munitions to Ukraine, which has put a lot of taxpayer dollars in the pockets of US defense contractors. Much like energy independence on Russia, strategic dependence on the United States has been primarily of Europe's choosing. Europe has been glad to let the United States flip the bill on their defense.
Only 9 of the 30 NATO member states meet the 2% GDP spending expectation for their military.
Due to lack of demand, Europe's defense industry has atrophied.
As Politico reports, in response to the uptick in demand for armaments due to the war in Ukraine, European defense firms are trying to play catch-up, intensifying production and their own capabilities. But many European contracts have still been going abroad to places like the US and even South Korea. As a company, we are investing hundreds of millions now in making sure that we can meet the demand, said Michael Johannesson, CEO of the Swedish defense firm Saab, whose shoulder-mounted rocket launchers, called NLAWs, have been critical for Ukraine. The problem of the European defense industry is that it is used to producing complex weapons in very small series over a long period of time, which suits the peacetime situation, said David Schauer, chief financial officer of the Czech Republic's biggest weapons producer, Czechoslovak Group. But the security environment has changed. Billions in investments are needed. Now, I will say it's mighty convenient that defense industry reps are calling for more money to flow to their industry, and national security is often used as a flimsy pretext for all sorts of unnecessary or unwise government action. That said, Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine does suggest that maybe, even in the 21st century, Europeans aren't as safe as they thought they were. Also, we are literally talking about weapons production here. National security isn't some ancillary quality for those. Furthermore, this is something that American officials as well have been warning them about for a very long time.
As the Brookings Institute reports, U.S. support for greater European defense efforts has always been conditional. Successive U.S. administrations have supported European moves to bolster their defense capabilities, provided that such efforts would strengthen, rather than weaken, the political cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance. Those conditions were framed most prominently in 1998 by former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, following a UK-France meeting at St. Malo, at which London and Paris declared that the EU must have the capacity for autonomous action. Secretary Albright penned a piece in the Financial Times stating that U.S. support for greater European efforts would be contingent on avoiding the 3 Ds. Discrimination against non-EU NATO members, decoupling of European and North American security, and duplication of NATO's operation planning system or its command structure. No duplication was neither defined nor intended to mean Europe should not develop certain capabilities that already existed in the alliance. Indeed, much of the Clinton administration's efforts at the time, such as the NATO Defense Capability Initiative, sought to prod the Europeans into developing precisely such capabilities. This distinction has been lost on analysts who have posited that the United States has opposed any European moves to improve their capacity to act. Since then, Europe has become only more dependent on the United States for their security both in terms of strategy and production capability. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more NATO member states have pledged to meet their 2% GDP defense spending obligations, as well as meet NATO's minimum capability requirements, which includes meeting basic industrial infrastructure needs to produce their own armaments. We'll see if they make good on these commitments. Until then, they'll continue to be woefully dependent on the United States' military-industrial complex for their own defense. Is the United States making money off the war in Ukraine? Well, the U.S. federal government, which is funded by we, the taxpayers, has been spending lots of money, that's for sure, but a lot of that money is going to companies within the United States. These companies are politically well connected, and I'm sure they're just fine with things going as they are now over in Ukraine. But, as I said earlier in this video, there were those who were telling European leaders for decades now to change their course and cut their twin dependencies on Russian energy and American arms. Their failure to prepare for this is one of the big reasons why Europe is currently in the position it's in. If Kyle had done just a little bit of research, he might have figured this out, and he wouldn't blame America first.